The morning Virginia Merritt drove her late husband's rusted plow into the cracked earth of the south field. The banker from Harlow County was still laughing about it 3 miles away in town, and she could almost hear him. It was the spring of 1878, deep in the Texas Panhandle, where the wind came off the flat plains like it had a grudge against everything upright, and the sky stretched so wide and empty that a person could feel swallowed whole by the sheer enormity of the land. Virginia had lived on this 40-acre parcel for 6 years, first as a new bride full of hope, then as a struggling farmer's wife, and now, since the previous October, as a widow of 31 who owed the First Consolidated Bank of Harlow $214 and had exactly 40 cents to her name. Her husband, Robert Merritt, had been a good man in all the ways that mattered to the heart, and a poor one in all the ways that mattered to survival. He had loved Virginia completely, worked hard from before dawn until after dark, and still managed to plant the wrong crops in the wrong seasons and borrow money at the wrong time from the wrong people. When the fever took him in October, he had left her the 40 acres, a mule named Chester, a broken-down plow, a house with a leaking roof, 3 laying hens, and a debt that the bank seemed far more interested in collecting than they had ever been in helping him pay. She had gone to the bank in November, hat in hand, her dark hair pinned neatly beneath it, her gray eyes steady despite the grief still raw in her chest, and asked for an extension. Harlan Voss, the bank manager, had looked at her over the rims of his spectacles with an expression that suggested she was wasting his very important time. "Mrs. Merritt," he had said, lacing his thick fingers together on top of the desk like a man about to deliver a verdict he had already decided before she walked in. "Your husband mortgaged that property on the understanding that he would make it productive. Now, I have reviewed the soil assessments we had done when he first applied for the loan, and I will tell you plainly what I told him. That south field is caliche clay. Nothing grows in caliche clay. Your husband planted wheat 2 years running and lost both crops. The land is worthless, and frankly the bank's patience with the Merritt property has been considerable. With respect, Mr. Voss," Virginia had said, keeping her voice even, "corn grows in caliche if you work the soil right and time the planting with the rain season. My father farmed similar land in East Kansas. I know what I am doing." Harlan Voss had smiled the way a man smiles when he has already decided not to believe a word you are saying. "Mrs. Merritt, corn requires reliable water, and the aquifer beneath your property is too deep to reach economically. Your husband sank 2 wells and got nothing worth pulling. The bank cannot in good conscience extend a loan on the basis of a widow's optimism. He had given her until June the 1st to pay the debt in full or surrender the deed. That was November. It was now the last week of March, and Virginia Merritt was plowing. She worked Chester hard through the morning, breaking up the pale, stubborn earth with the plow's iron blade, working in careful rows across the south field where the soil was worst, and where Harlan Voss had declared nothing would ever grow. Her arms ached before noon. Her back was a column of fire by 2 in the afternoon. She stopped only to drink from the canteen she had hung on the plow handle and to let Chester rest, rubbing the old mule's dusty nose and talking to him softly the way she had always talked to animals and to Robert and now mostly to herself. She did not let herself think about June the 1st. She thought about the soil instead. Her father, James Alcott, had farmed alkali-heavy earth in southeastern Kansas in the years after the war, and he had taught her that caliche was not a death sentence for crops. It was a challenge that required patience and specific knowledge. You had to break the hardpan layer deep enough to allow drainage, work dried manure and composted grass into the top 8 inches, plant corn kernels at the right depth in early April before the serious heat arrived, and then pray for the right kind of spring rains. You had to believe the land had something to give even when it looked like it had nothing. Virginia believed. She had believed it with enough conviction to spend her last 40 cents on a 50-pound sack of seed corn from Haverson's dry goods store in town, And when Luther Haverson had raised an eyebrow and said, "You planting in the Merritt South field?" she had said, "I am." And he had not said another word, but he had given her a full 50-pound sack for the price of a 40-pound one, and she had walked home carrying it on her back without letting herself feel the weight of his pity. It was on the fourth day of plowing, in the late afternoon when the light turned the color of hammered copper, and the wind finally settled into something almost gentle, that she became aware she was being watched. She stopped at the end of a row and looked toward the fence line to the north, where the Merritt property bordered the Ford ranch. She had known Timothy Ford existed in the way you know about weather systems. He was a presence in the region, a fact of the landscape, a man people discussed in terms of what he owned rather than who he was. He held 800 acres to the north and east, ran about 300 head of cattle, kept a small crew of ranch hands, and had the reputation of being a man of very few words who nonetheless managed his operation with a kind of quiet competence that other ranchers in Harlow County both respected and faintly resented. He was standing at the fence line, one boot on the lowest rail, his arms resting on the top rail, watching her. He was a tall man, lean in the way that comes from years of physical work rather than lack of eating, with dark hair that had gone silver at the temples, though he could not have been more than 36 or 37. His face was tanned to the color of old saddle leather, and carried the kind of stillness that Virginia associated with men who had learned not to react to things quickly, because, in their experience, reacting quickly often made things worse. He did not say anything when she looked at him. He just looked back. His hat was pushed back on his head at an angle that might have been casual or might have been deliberate, and his dark eyes were steady and serious. Virginia considered him for a moment and then said, "Can I help you with something, Mr. Ford?" "No," he said. She waited for more. He did not offer more. She turned Chester around and started the next row. He watched for another 10 minutes, and then she heard the soft creak of the fence rail releasing his weight, and when she looked up again at the end of the row, he was gone. He came back the next morning. She was working the composted manure she had been gathering and drying all winter into the broken soil, turning it in with a hand fork in the sections she had already plowed, and she looked up to find him there again at the fence line in the same posture, watching with that same still expression. "Good morning," she said, not stopping her work. "Morning," he said. "You are welcome to just come and ask whatever it is you want to ask," she said. Standing at the fence watching a woman work seems like a long way around it. There was a pause, then, "Corn," she looked up. "That's right." He looked at the field for a moment. The pale, broken earth stretched away from her in rough rows, still looking like nothing so much as a graveyard for agricultural ambitions. "That's the South field," he said. "It is." Another pause. "Caliche clay." "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. She kept working, turning the dark manure into the pale soil, watching them blend into something that at least looked like it might have possibilities. "I have seen men try to farm that field," he said at last. "Your husband tried. Before him, the Corley family tried for 2 seasons. Corley lost everything." Virginia straightened, pushed a strand of dark hair from her face, and looked at him directly. "With respect to the memory of the Corley family and to my husband, neither of them broke the hardpan deep enough to allow drainage, and neither of them amended the soil properly. My father farmed similar land in Kansas. I know what this field needs." Timothy Ford looked at her for a long moment. His expression did not change exactly, but something shifted in his eyes, some subtle alteration in the quality of his attention that she noticed without being able to fully name. "What does it need?" he asked. "Deep breaking, which I have done," she said. "Good organic matter worked into the top soil, which I am doing now. A strain of corn that can handle alkaline conditions, which I have in a 50-pound sack in my house, and rain at the right time, which I cannot control." "You cannot control the rain," he repeated, not with mockery, just as a plain acknowledgement of fact. "No," she agreed, "but I can control everything else." He nodded slowly once, the way a man nods when he has received information he is filing away carefully. "Voss at the bank gave you until June," he said. She felt a small jolt of something, not quite surprise, because in a county this small everyone knew everyone else's business, but something close to it. "He did," she said, her voice steady. "That is not much time," Timothy Ford said. "No," she agreed. "It is not." He pushed off the fence rail, settled his hat back down on his head and said, "I will let you get on with it," and walked back toward his own property with that long, unhurried stride. Virginia watched him go and then turned back to her work, but she found herself thinking about the quality of stillness in his face, the way he had asked questions as though the answers genuinely mattered to him, and the fact that he had said nothing about the land being worthless, nothing about the foolishness of her plan, nothing that Harlan Voss had said. He had simply asked what the field needed, and when she told him, he had listened. She planted the corn during the first week of April, on the warmest days when the soil temperature was right, walking the rows with a hand dibber her father had made for her years ago, pressing each kernel into the earth at the right depth, spacing them with the careful attention of someone who understood that each one of those seeds represented not just a future plant, but a piece of her salvation. Her hands were blistered before she finished. She did not stop. Timothy Ford was at the fence each morning. He never stayed long, rarely said more than a few words, but he was there, and Virginia found herself aware of his presence the way you are aware of a landmark, something fixed and reliable in the landscape that helps you understand where you are. She began to find it steadying rather than intrusive. On the 5th morning of planting, he said, "My well tender spotted a break in the east water line yesterday. I will be running a repair crew along the fence line today." Virginia looked up from her planting. "All right," she said, not sure what else to say. "The repair will bring them close to your property line," he said, "along the north edge of your south field." "I see," she said. "I mention it in case the sound disturbs your work," he said. "It will not disturb me," she said. He nodded and started to turn away. Then he stopped and said, without turning back, "The soil looks better than it did last week." Virginia looked down at the dark, amended earth around her feet and felt something warm and quietly fierce rise in her chest. "It does," she agreed. He walked away without another word. She planted the rest of the row feeling somehow lighter than she had felt in months. The repair crew that arrived along the fence line that afternoon was 4 men, and they worked the entire length of the north boundary of her south field with tools and water pipe. And when they were packing up to leave, the youngest one, a freckled boy of about 20 named Pete who seemed to be using cheerfulness as a primary life philosophy, called across the fence, "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Merritt, but Mr. Ford says to tell you there is a secondary aquifer at about 40 feet on the northeast corner of your property. He says it is not on the survey because the survey is old. He says if you ever need a well dug, he knows a man." Virginia stood very still for a moment, the late afternoon sun warm on her face, the smell of turned earth around her, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. It was not hope exactly, though it contained hope. It was more like the sudden, startling recognition that she was not entirely alone in this. "Tell Mr. Ford I am grateful," she said. Pete grinned. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and led the other men away. She looked at the northeast corner of her south field for a long moment. Then she went back to her planting. Rain came in the 2nd week of April, and it came in exactly the right way, not the violent, eroding storms that could wash out newly planted seed, but 3 days of steady, soaking rain that moved through slowly and settled into the soil without running off. Virginia stood on her porch each morning and watched it fall with an expression of such fierce gratitude that it might have looked like anger from a distance. She checked her field each evening, walking the rows with her skirt tucked up and her boots dark with wet earth, pressing her fingers into the soil to feel how deep the moisture had penetrated. It had penetrated deep, past the hardpan she had broken, down into the amended earth. She allowed herself, in the privacy of her kitchen that night with the rain still soft on the roof, to feel something very close to joy. Timothy Ford knocked on her door on a Thursday afternoon in the third week of April, which was the first time he had come to the house itself rather than standing at the fence line. Virginia had flour on her hands and her hair coming loose from its pins, and she opened the door to find him standing on her porch with his hat in his hands, which surprised her because she had never seen him without his hat on before, and she realized with a small, private start that he was quite a good-looking man in the quiet, serious way of men who have never thought much about it. "I apologize for disturbing you," he said. "You are not disturbing me," she said. "Come in." He stepped into the kitchen and looked around with the careful attention he seemed to give to everything, taking in the neatly organized shelves, the clean stove, the stack of seed catalogs on the table that she had been making notes in, the single-framed picture on the wall that was a drawing of mountains that her mother had made and sent her years ago. His eyes rested on the seed catalogs and the notes for a moment. "Can I offer you coffee?" Virginia asked, already moving to the stove. "Thank you," he said. He sat in the chair she indicated, and she noticed that he sat the way he stood, without taking up more space than he needed. She made the coffee and brought 2 cups to the table and sat across from him, and for a moment they both looked at the cups and the comfortable strangeness of the situation settled around them. "I have been speaking with Ben Haverson," Timothy Ford said at last. Ben was Luther's older brother and the water assessment man in Harlow County, about the secondary aquifer. Virginia set her cup down. "And he says it is real. He has seen reference to it in older survey notes that were filed with the county and then largely forgotten. He says it sits at approximately 38 to 42 feet in the northeast quarter of your south field." He paused. "It would be enough to support a serious crop if it was accessed." Virginia was quiet for a moment. "A well," she said. "Yes. Wells cost money," she said, "which I do not have." "I know," he said. He turned the coffee cup in his hands, not drinking yet, just turning it. "I would like to offer to have my crew dig it," he said, "at no cost to you." Virginia looked at him. The directness of the offer surprised her, and so did the lack of ceremony around it, no winding up to it, no elaborate framing, just the plain statement of what he was proposing. "That is a considerable offer," she said carefully. "It is," he agreed. "May I ask why?" He was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window and lay in a warm rectangle on the wooden table between them. "I have watched you work that field for 3 weeks," he said. "I have seen a lot of people approach that land without knowing what they were doing. You know what you are doing." He paused again. "You deserve a fair chance." Virginia felt the words settle into her, not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with the solid, quiet weight of something true. "And if the crop fails anyway?" she asked. "You would have spent the cost of a well for nothing." "If the crop fails after you have done everything right," he said, "then the fault belongs to the weather, and I can live with that. What I cannot live with is watching someone fail for want of water when I know where the water is." Virginia Merritt looked at Timothy Ford across the kitchen table. This quiet, serious man who had stood at her fence every morning for 3 weeks and asked questions that suggested he was actually paying attention to the answers. And she felt something shift inside her. Something she had kept very carefully closed and still since October. Something that had nothing to do with corn or wells or bank debts, and everything to do with the fact that this man, without a great deal of words or ceremony, had just told her that he believed in what she was doing. "Yes," she said. "I accept your offer and I am grateful for it." He nodded, and something that was almost, not quite, but almost a smile moved briefly across his face. "I will have the crew start Monday," he said. He stayed for another half hour, drinking his coffee and looking at her seed catalog notes, and they talked about soil and water tables, and the particular challenges of farming in the Panhandle, with a seriousness and specificity that felt to Virginia like genuine conversation, the kind where both people are actually thinking, and not just waiting for their turn to speak. When he stood to leave, he put his hat back on and said, "The first shoots should appear in about 3 weeks if the soil temperature holds." 12 to 14 days, actually, Virginia said. The April planting conditions were ideal. He looked at her with that quality of close attention that she was beginning to recognize as simply how he regarded things he found worth regarding. 12 to 14 days, he repeated, as though correcting his own estimate in his mental ledger. Good. He left. Virginia stood in her kitchen for a moment looking at the 2 empty coffee cups on the table and felt an expression on her face that it took her a moment to identify. She was smiling. The well crew arrived Monday morning, 4 of Timothy's ranch hands plus Ben Haverson with his equipment, and they worked the northeast corner of the south field for 3 days. Chester regarded them from across the property with deep mule suspicion. Virginia brought them water from her kitchen well and cornbread at noon, and said very little, watching with her arms folded, and her eyes tracking every foot of depth they achieved with the intensity of someone for whom this was not a construction project but a lifeline. On the second day, at 39 feet, they hit water. The shout went up from the young hand named Pete, who seemed unable to contain his own enthusiasm even about things that were not his, and Virginia walked to the edge of the dug shaft and looked down and saw the dark gleam of water at the bottom, and felt her throat close with something she refused to let become tears in front of these men. Good pressure, Ben Haverson said, his voice professionally matter-of-fact. Enough to run an irrigation channel along your east rows. You might even get a second channel off the west spur if the pressure holds up. It will hold up, Virginia said, with a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than information. Ben looked at her, and then down at the well and then back at her, and there was something in his expression that reminded her of the way her father used to look at her when she was right about something he had not expected her to know. Yes, he said, I believe it will. Timothy came to the fence that evening after his crew had gone, as the sun was going down in sheets of orange and deep red behind the flat horizon, and Virginia walked across the south field to meet him. Her boots were dusty and her hands were rough, and there was a smear of well clay on her left sleeve that she had stopped caring about hours ago, and when she reached the fence she looked at him and said, 39 feet. I heard, he said, the pressure is good. Ben told me. They stood on either side of the fence for a moment, the evening settling around them, the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky to the east. The air smelled of dry grass and the faint coolness that came after the heat of the day let go. I do not know how to thank you properly, Virginia said. You do not need to thank me, he said. The well is on your property. It belongs to you. Your crew dug it, she said. They needed the work, he said, which was so clearly not entirely true, but so clearly the kind of thing he would say rather than accept gratitude that it made something warm and complicated move through Virginia's chest. Timothy, she said, and then stopped, because she had used his first name for the first time and neither of them had established that kind of footing yet, and she felt the slight awkwardness of it. He looked at her steadily. Virginia, he said, and that was all, just her name. But the way he said it with that careful, deliberate quality made it feel like a decision rather than an accident. She found herself looking at him in the fading light and noticing things she had not quite let herself notice before. The way his eyes carried a quiet kind of warmth beneath the reserve. The particular set of his jaw that suggested a stubbornness she recognized because she shared it. The fact that when he was not wearing his hat he looked somehow both younger and more serious at the same time. I would like to invite you to supper on Sunday, she said, if you are willing. He was quiet for a moment. I am willing, he said. Sunday supper turned out to be the occasion on which Virginia discovered that Timothy Ford, in the right company, with the guard down slightly, and a meal in front of him that he had not had to cook himself, was a man who could actually talk. Not at length, not the way some men talked, filling all available silence with their own voice, but steadily and thoughtfully about things that interested him, which turned out to be land and water and weather, and the particular challenges of ranging cattle in the Panhandle. And Virginia found herself talking back in the same vein. And then the conversation moved, the way conversations do when both people are genuinely comfortable, into less practical territory, into families and histories and losses. She told him about Robert, plainly and without drama, the way she thought about him now that the sharpest edge of the grief had softened into something more like a permanent tenderness. He was a good man, she said. He loved this land even when it did not love him back. He just did not know how to make it work. A lot of men came to this country with the idea that wanting it enough would be sufficient, Timothy said. He was looking at his hands around his coffee cup, and his expression carried something that she read as personal familiarity with the idea. Wanting is not the same as knowing. No, she agreed. Did you want this land when you came here? I wanted to build something, he said. Something that would still be standing when I was not. He paused. I came from Tennessee. The family farm there was worn out, the soil exhausted, my father exhausted. I was 22. I wanted land that had not already given everything it had. He looked up at her. This land requires things from you, but it gives back if you understand what it needs. It does, Virginia said quietly. They sat in the lamplight for a moment, the kitchen warm around them, Chester audible from the barn in a distant, meditative sort of way, and the evening outside full of the sound of spring insects. You lost people too, she said. It was not quite a question. He was still for a moment. My wife, he said. 8 years ago, fever, he looked at the window. We had been married 3 years. She was from Georgia. She never fully suited herself to the Panhandle. I think perhaps she was always a little homesick. I am sorry, Virginia said, and she meant it with the full weight of someone who understood exactly what that kind of loss felt like. We both have ghosts, he said simply, bringing his eyes back to hers. I suspect that is not unusual for people who have lived past 30 in this country. They sat in the comfortable quiet of two people who have shared something real and have not yet decided what to do with the closeness it has created. When Timothy stood to leave, he held her hand briefly as he said good night, not with the careful deliberateness of someone making a gesture, but with the natural ease of someone who was not thinking about it, and then seemed to realize what he had done and released her hand and looked at her with an expression that was the closest thing to uncertainty she had yet seen on his face. Virginia did not say anything about it, but she was still thinking about it when she went asleep. The corn sprouted on the 11th day. Virginia was in the south field at first light, checking the moisture level of the soil the way she did every morning now that the well was running through the irrigation channels Timothy's crew had helped her cut. And she saw it first in the third row from the east, a tiny crook of green just pushing through the pale soil, the seed coat still visible on the bend of the first shoot, so small and fragile and impossibly alive that she went down on one knee in the dirt and looked at it for a long time. Then she went down the rows, moving quickly, and they were coming up everywhere, dozens of small green breaks in the pale earth, scattered through the field like promises. Not all of them, not yet, but enough, the beginning of a stand that looked as though it intended to be real. She stood in the middle of the south field with her hands at her sides and looked at the sprouts for a while. Then she walked to the fence line and waited. Timothy arrived at his usual time, about 20 minutes after first light, and saw her standing at the fence rather than working in the field, and something in his expression changed before he had even reached the fence himself. "They are up," she said. He climbed through the fence without asking, the first time he had done that, and walked with her down the east row, and she watched him look at the tiny green shoots with the same close, serious attention he gave everything, stopping occasionally to kneel and look more closely, touching the soil near one of the sprouts to check the moisture level, looking at the sky to the west where the next weather system was a distant possibility. "Good even spacing," he said. "Good depth. The irrigation moisture is right." "It is," she said. He stood and looked at the field, and then he looked at her, and the expression on his face was something she had not seen from him before, open and warm and entirely without the reserve he usually carried, and it made him look like himself, the way people look when they forget to present the version of themselves they normally present, and simply are who they are instead. "Virginia," he said, "this is going to work." She felt the words go into her the way water goes into dry earth. She had believed it herself, had built her entire future on that belief, but hearing it from someone else, from this particular someone who chose his words with such care and did not say things he did not mean, made it suddenly and completely real in a way it had only been internally real before. "Yes," she said, and her voice came out a little different than usual, a little less steady, and she saw him notice that and saw him make a small, deliberate decision to close the remaining distance between them, and do what he probably should not do yet and did anyway, putting his hand gently along her jaw and looking at her for a long, serious moment to make sure this was welcome. It was. She kissed him in the cornfield with the sun coming up behind them and the tiny green shoots around their feet and the vast Panhandle sky overhead. And it was not a tentative kiss or a gentle experimental one. It was the kiss of two people who have been building toward something for weeks and have both known exactly what they were building and have simply been waiting for the right moment to arrive. When they stepped back from each other, they were both quiet for a moment, not with awkwardness but with the particular thoughtful silence of people absorbing something significant. "I should tell you," Timothy said, "that I have been thinking about this for some time." "I know," Virginia said. "So have I." He looked at her with that warmth openly in his face now, not hidden. "I did not want to complicate things while you were fighting for this field," he said. "You have been helping me fight for it from the beginning," she said. "Yes," he said, but helping seemed appropriate. Complicating seemed selfish. Virginia looked at him. This man who had stood at her fence every morning and dug her a well, and helped her cut irrigation channels and come to Sunday supper, and held her hand, and spent 8 weeks thinking about her while trying not to make her life harder, and felt something she recognized from a long time ago, from the early days with Robert before everything got difficult, but deeper now, more considered. The feeling of a woman who has lived enough life to know exactly what she is feeling and exactly why. "You are not a complication," she said. "You are a neighbor who became a friend and is now something I need to think about carefully." "That is fair," he said. "I have June the 1st to think about," she said, "and corn to grow." "I know," he said. "After June the 1st, she said. He nodded with that quality of patience that seemed to come naturally to him and which she had come to think of as one of his best qualities. "After June the 1st, he agreed. But they both knew that something had shifted between them, and as he climbed back through the fence and she went back to her morning work, neither of them was pretending otherwise. May brought warmth and more of the right kind of rain, and the corn responded to both with the steady, quiet enthusiasm of a plant that has found its conditions and intends to take full advantage of them. By the middle of May, the stand was 3 feet tall, and it was even, it was dense, and it was unmistakably the healthiest-looking crop anyone in the vicinity of Harlow County had seen growing on the south field of the Merritt property, which people had begun to drive past slowly on their way to and from town, looking at it with expressions that ranged from surprise to stunned to, in the case of Harlan Voss, who Virginia saw pass twice in his buggy, something more complex and less comfortable. Luther Haverson mentioned it to her one afternoon in the dry goods store, with the careful way of a man trying not to look too interested. "People are talking about your corn," he said. "I know," Virginia said pleasantly, making her minimal purchase of salt and 1 tin of coffee. "Saying it's looking good," he said. "It is looking very good," she said. "Voss must have seen it by now," Luther said, and the slight emphasis on Voss's name conveyed everything he was too polite to say directly. "Mr. Voss can see whatever he likes," Virginia said. "What he told me about that land was wrong, and the corn growing in it is evidence of that. It would be good of him to acknowledge it. But whether he does or not is not my concern. What I grow is my concern." Luther looked at her with something that was entirely not pity now. "You are something, Virginia Merritt," he said. She left without answering but walked back down the main street of Harlow carrying her salt and coffee with her back straight and her chin up. And she did not let herself feel anything other than determination until she was back on her property and alone with Chester and the south field. And then she stood at the edge of the corn and looked at its green height and let herself feel a little bit of fierce triumph. Just a little, just enough to sustain her. Timothy was working the far end of his eastern pasture that afternoon, and she could see him from her field, a small figure in the distance moving along his fence line in the way of a man doing the endless maintenance work that kept a ranch from falling into disrepair. She raised her hand. He raised his. That was enough. It was on a Saturday, the 22nd of May, that Harlan Voss came to her door. He came alone, without the town constable she had half expected him to bring, without anyone official, just himself in his good coat with his hat held in both hands, which was so different from the posture of their November meeting that it registered immediately. He stood on her porch looking like a man who is rehearsing something in his head and finding the available versions all inadequate. "Mrs. Merritt," he said. "Mr. Voss," she said. She did not invite him in. He looked at the south field, which was visible from the porch, 4 feet tall now and green and vigorous and impossible to dismiss. He looked at it for a long moment. "The corn is coming along," he said. "It is," she said. "I may have misjudged the potential of the field," he said. He was a proud man, and the words appeared to cost him something real. Virginia did not relieve him of the cost. "You did misjudge it," she said. "And you told me the land was worthless in a way that was intended to end the conversation. It almost did." He looked at her. "I was going on previous experience," he said, not quite defensive, not quite apologetic, somewhere in the territory between. "Experience is valuable," Virginia said, "but it is not always complete. My father knew how to work caliche clay. That knowledge exists. It is not hidden. You could have sent me to someone who knew rather than telling me there was nothing to know." Harlan Voss was quiet. Then, "That is fair," he said, which was possibly the most surprising thing she had ever heard him say. "I would like to discuss the debt," Virginia said. "If you have come for that purpose." "I have," he said. He reached into his coat and produced some papers. "The corn is clearly going to yield. I have spoken to the county assessor about the property value in light of the aquifer Ben Haverson confirmed, and I would like to offer an extension of the mortgage terms, with a revised assessment of the property as collateral, which would reduce your monthly obligation significantly." Virginia looked at the papers. She thought about November, when she had come to him with this same request, and he had dismissed her. She thought about the 40 cents she had spent on corn seed. She thought about Timothy at the fence every morning. He thought about the sprouts on the 11th day. "I will review these with someone I trust before I sign anything," she said. Voss blinked. "Of course," he said. "I will send word to your office by Tuesday," she said. He left. She stood on the porch for a moment looking at the south field, and then she did something she had not allowed herself to do in front of anyone for months. She let out a long, shaking breath and put her hand over her mouth and felt her eyes go hot. Then she straightened, went inside, made coffee, reviewed the papers herself that evening, and then on Sunday reviewed them again with Timothy Ford sitting across her kitchen table, who read them with the careful attention he brought to everything and said, after a long silence, "The revised terms are fair, better than fair, actually. He is reducing the interest rate. He is trying to make right a mistake without saying so plainly," Virginia said. "Yes," Timothy agreed, "which is the closest some men get to an apology." She looked at him. He was looking at the papers, the lamplight falling across his face, and she thought about what he had said months ago about wanting to build something that would still be standing when he was not. And she thought about the well his crew had dug, and the irrigation channels, and the 39 feet of water that was even now moving through her south field, keeping her corn alive. And she thought that she was sitting here with someone who had chosen, quietly and without asking for anything in return, to help her build something too. "After June the 1st, she said softly. He looked up from the papers. His expression was everything she needed it to be. "June the 1st is 9 days away," he said. "I know," she said. "The corn will be harvestable in August," he said. "I know that too." He set the papers down and looked at her with an openness that was becoming familiar to her now, the way his face changed when they were alone and there was no one to maintain a professional distance for. "I have been thinking," he said. "So have I," she said. "Have you reached any conclusions?" He asked, and there was something almost careful in the question, as though he was genuinely uncertain of the answer, and it mattered to him very much. "Several," Virginia said. "The first is that you are the most decent and quietly remarkable man I have met in my adult life. The second is that I have not felt about anyone the way I feel about you in a very long time. The third is that I am frightened of that, because loss is something I am familiar with and more of it is something I would prefer to avoid." He was quiet for a moment. "I know about that kind of fear," he said. "I lived with it for years, after my wife." He looked at the window, at the dark beyond it, and then back at her. "I do not think that fear goes away entirely. I think it changes. It becomes something you carry alongside what you feel rather than something that prevents you from feeling." Virginia looked at him in the lamplight. "Timothy," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think you should know that I intend to sign the revised mortgage agreement on Tuesday, and I intend to harvest the corn in August, and after August I intend to plant wheat in the north field and try for a full rotation next year." "I know," he said. "And I think you should know that I intend to be here for all of it," she said. "This is my land. Whatever else happens, this is where I intend to be." "I know that too," he said. "I wanted to be clear about it," she said. "You have always been very clear," he said, and the warmth in his voice was so complete and so unguarded that it made her breath catch. "Virginia, I would very much like to court you properly." She looked at him. "You have been courting me improperly for 2 months," she said. A genuine smile crossed his face then, a full one, and it transformed him in the way that full smiles transform reserved people, making them suddenly themselves in a way that partial expressions do not. "I have been courting you quietly," he said. "I would like to do it less quietly." "I think," Virginia said, "that would be acceptable." June the 1st came and went without drama. Virginia signed the revised mortgage papers on a Tuesday morning, and Harlan Voss handed them to her across his desk, with a formality that suggested he was trying to preserve some dignity in the situation. And she signed them clearly, and folded her copy and put it in her dress pocket, and thanked him with a politeness that was genuine rather than performative, because she did not believe in holding grudges longer than the situation required. She walked out of the bank into the bright June morning of Harlow, Texas, in 1878, and stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment with the papers in her pocket and the sound of the town around her, horses and voices, and the distant metallic sound of the smithy, and felt something she had not felt since before Robert died, a kind of clear, open possibility, the sense that the next thing was hers to decide rather than something that was happening to her. Timothy was waiting outside with his horse, which she had not expected, and he looked at her as she came out of the bank and said, "Well, signed," she said. He held out his hand, and she took it, and they walked together down the wooden sidewalk of Harlow with his large, warm hand wrapped around hers, and a few people looked and a few people did not, and Virginia did not spare a thought for any of them. They had supper at the hotel dining room that evening, which was the nicest establishment in Harlow, and required Timothy to wear the good coat he seemed to own specifically for civic occasions, and which fit him well enough to make Virginia aware of it in a way she found simultaneously pleasant and slightly distracting. They ate beefsteak and potatoes, and drank the apple cider that was as close to a celebratory beverage as Harlow's hotel dining room offered, and Timothy asked her what she was going to do with the mortgage extension, and she told him about the Northfield wheat rotation plan, and he listened with full attention and offered several suggestions about varieties that did well in the Panhandle, and she made mental notes of his suggestions the way she always did, because he was not a man who recommended things without having thought about them. After supper they walked back along the main street in the evening, and the air was warm and the stars were out, and Virginia felt the particular contentment of a person who has survived something difficult and is now standing in a good place looking at a good view with a good person beside them. "I want to ask you something," Timothy said. "Ask it," she said. "I would like to have the minister over for supper at my ranch in July," he said. "And I would like to invite the Haversons and old Mary Coburn from up the ridge, because she has been alone since her husband passed, and she deserves a good supper and a reason to come out. Virginia looked at him. That is a lot of people for a man who does not usually say very many words, she said. I'm trying to say something, he said, with a patience that was familiar and dear. I know you are, she said. Say it plainly. He stopped walking and turned to face her, and the streetlight from the hardware store fell across him, and she could see his face clearly, serious and warm, and with a quality of absolute certainty about it that she trusted completely. I am asking if you will marry me, he said. I am asking plainly, and without a great deal of ceremony, because you have indicated that you prefer plain speech, and because I am fairly certain you know exactly what I mean and how much I mean it. Virginia looked at him for a moment. The night was warm around them. Somewhere down the street someone was playing a fiddle, and the sound drifted past like something from another world. I need to think, she said. He nodded. I will think until Thursday, she said. All right, he said. She thought until Thursday. She walked the south field every morning and talked to Chester in the evenings, and sat with her coffee at the kitchen table, and thought carefully and honestly about what she wanted and what she was afraid of and what she trusted and what she had learned in the past 8 months about herself and about Timothy Ford. She thought about Robert and about grief and about the particular quality of loneliness that is worse than ordinary loneliness because it comes after having been not lonely. And she thought about the way Timothy had stood at the fence on the first morning and asked questions and listened to the answers, and about the well at 39 feet, and about the corn sprouts on the 11th day, and about his hand on her jaw in the cornfield. On Thursday morning she walked to the fence line and waited. He came at his usual time and stopped at the fence and looked at her. Yes, she said. He climbed through the fence, and she did not move, and he came to her and took both her hands and held them and looked at her with everything he felt openly in his face. No reserve, no careful distance, just the full and honest weight of what was there. Yes, he said, as though confirming it. Yes, she repeated, and felt herself smiling in a way that had been absent for a very long time, not just happy smiling, but the kind that means your whole life is smiling. He kissed her in the cornfield again, and this time the corn was 6 feet tall and they were surrounded by it on all sides, the green walls of it, and she felt very small and very safe and very much exactly where she was supposed to be. They were married in July in the good sitting room of the Ford Ranch house, by the minister from Harlow, with Ben and Luther Haverson and old Mary Coburn from up the ridge as witnesses, and Pete the ranch hand, who seemed to feel personally responsible for the occasion because he had been the one to relay the message about the aquifer all those weeks ago, and who cried openly and without embarrassment during the ceremony. Mary Coburn, who was 71 and had buried 2 husbands and 4 cattlemen in her long life on the ridge, squeezed Virginia's hand before the minister began and said, "You know what you are doing." And it was not a question, and Virginia understood it was not about the wedding. The minister read from the book of Ruth, at Virginia's specific request, because she had always loved the plain, fierce quality of Ruth's commitment. And when he was done, Timothy slid a plain gold ring onto her finger and looked at her with those steady dark eyes, and she said her vows in a clear, steady voice, and felt each one go into the permanent record of who she was and who she was choosing to be. The harvest came in August, and it was everything Virginia had believed it would be. The corn stood tall and even across the south field, the ears heavy and full, the husks tight and green turning gold in the August sun. And when Virginia walked the rows with her harvest knife on the first morning of cutting, she felt a completeness that was as physical as anything she had ever felt, a deep, bodily rightness about a thing that had been accomplished through pure stubbornness and knowledge, and the refusal to accept someone else's verdict about what was possible. Timothy worked alongside her, and Pete, and 2 other ranch hands he had loaned her for the harvest week, and they worked from before sunrise to after sunset for 4 days, cutting and husking and stacking, and in the evenings Virginia made supper for everyone at the long table in the Ford Ranch house kitchen, where she had begun to keep her own shelves and her own order alongside Timothy's, and the conversation around the table was the comfortable, easy kind of people who have worked hard together all day toward a common purpose and can rest now. On the evening of the fourth day, when the last of the harvest was stacked and covered in the barn, Timothy sat on the porch steps with her and looked at the darkening south field across the fence and said nothing for a while, just sat with his arm around her shoulders and his coffee going cold in his other hand. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I am thinking about that first morning," he said, "when I saw you out there with Chester and the plow." "What did you think?" she asked. "I thought you were either the most knowledgeable farmer I had ever seen or the most stubborn person who ever lived," he said. "I was not sure which." "Both," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "Both." She leaned against him and felt the warm solidity of him, the particular reliability that had become one of the most important things in her daily life. "Do you know what I thought when I first saw you at the fence?" she asked. "What?" "I thought, there is a man who is actually looking at what I am doing rather than deciding in advance that it cannot work." He was quiet for a moment. "Was that rare?" "It was rarer than it should have been," she said. He pulled her slightly closer. The evening was going deep purple toward the west, and the stars were coming out over the ranch with that particular extravagance that was one of the things Virginia had decided she loved about the Panhandle, the way the sky at night felt like an argument for the largeness of everything. "The bank will want its first payment under the revised terms in September," she said. "I know," he said. "You have the money from the harvest." "I have more than the payment," she said. "I have enough to buy the seed for the Northfield wheat rotation." He turned his head to look at her. "You are going to plant through the winter." "Winter wheat goes in October," she said. "Yes." He looked at her, and that almost smile was fully deployed now, the complete version, and he shook his head slightly in the manner of someone acknowledging that they are continuously impressed. "Virginia Ford," he said, trying the name. "Virginia Merritt Ford," she said firmly. "I am keeping Merritt. Robert was a good man and the land was his first." "Virginia Merritt Ford," he said without argument, with the ease of someone who understood what mattered about names. "We should think about expanding the south field," she said. "If the wheat rotation works, the north field will recover and I can run 3 fields in rotation. I would need more hands during harvest season, which, given that I am now married to a man with a full ranch crew, is perhaps not the impossible logistics problem it once was." He was laughing quietly, the way he did everything without excess. "You are already planning next year," he said. "I have been planning next year since November," she said. He kissed the side of her head, and she felt his smile against her hair, and the evening sat around them complete and warm. The months that followed had the quality of good honest work, and the particular happiness that comes from building something alongside the right person. Virginia's Northfield winter wheat went in during October, and by spring it was showing the kind of even, strong stand that the amended soil and the Panhandle winter rains had produced, and the February assessment she had requested from the county agriculture man confirmed what she already knew, that she was running a competent, productive small farm operation on land that had previously been assessed as worthless. She took that assessment to Harlan Voss's office in March, not because she needed to, not because the mortgage required it, but because she thought it important that the record be correct. Voss read it in silence and then looked up at her over his spectacles with an expression that combined discomfort and something more genuine beneath it. "I owe you an apology," he said, which were 4 words she had not expected to hear from Harlan Voss. "You do," she agreed pleasantly. "The bank made an error in assessing the potential of your property," he said. "I relied on incomplete information, and I communicated my assessment in a manner that was not helpful to you." "No," she agreed. "It was not." "I am glad the farming is going well," he said, and she believed that he meant it, in the complicated way that people mean things when they have been wrong about something and are trying to figure out how to incorporate the wrongness into their understanding of themselves. "Thank you, Mr. Voss," she said. "So am I." She walked home along the road between town and the ranch in the spring morning, and the Texas Panhandle spread out around her in every direction, flat and vast, and full of a complex beauty that she had come to love with the particular depth that comes from having fought for something. And she thought about the trajectory of the past 14 months, from widow with 40 cents to farmer with a working operation, from alone to partnered with someone who saw her clearly and believed in what she could do. She was not quite 33. Timothy was 38. They had both lived enough to know the difference between a thing that was good and a thing that was right, and this was both. Timothy was in the east pasture when she got home, moving cattle with Pete and two other hands, and he raised a hand when he saw her coming up the road, and she raised one back and felt the small, private satisfaction of that exchange, the ordinary eloquence of two people who have learned each other's language. At supper that evening she told him about the meeting with Voss, and he listened with his full attention and said, "He apologized." "He did," she said. "Good," Timothy said simply, and went back to his supper with the matter-of-fact quality of a man for whom an apology that has been deserved and delivered is a resolved matter requiring no further discussion, which was one of the things she loved about him, the way he did not require things to be more complicated than they were. "I want to talk to you about something," Virginia said. He looked up. She had his full attention immediately, which she also loved, the way he moved to attention for her. "I have been thinking about the land differently," she said. "What I have on the south field and what the north field is going to give me in the spring harvest, and what is possible next year if the rotation holds. Timothy, I think this farm could genuinely sustain itself, not just pay the mortgage, actually produce and sustain itself." "I know it can," he said. "More than that," she said. "I think it could employ 2 or 3 hands full-time in the harvest season. I think there is enough water in the aquifer for double the current south field acreage if I expand toward the east. I think—" "Virginia," he said. "Yes. You have been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since February," she admitted. "Tell me all of it," he said. He pushed his plate aside slightly and folded his arms on the table and gave her the expression of a man who is ready to be in a meeting for as long as required, and she looked at him across the lamplight with a warmth so large and so complete that it took her a moment to locate her notes in her mind. She told him all of it. He listened to all of it. He asked 23 questions. She counted, all of them good ones that sharpened her thinking on points she had not fully resolved. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours after supper was cleared and talked about soil and water and crop rotation, and the economics of small farm operation in the Texas Panhandle in 1879. And when they finally went to bed, Virginia lay in the dark thinking about the northeast quarter of the south field where the aquifer was deepest, and whether the soil composition there would support a second corn planting. And Timothy said into the dark beside her, "For the expanded planting, you will need to think about the seasonal wind pattern in the northeast quadrant because it shifts in July and can dry the corn faster than the irrigation can compensate." She turned her head. "Are you still thinking about it too?" "I am always thinking about the land," he said. "So am I," she said. There was a comfortable pause. "Good match, then," he said. She reached for his hand in the dark and found it. "Yes," she said, "a very good match." Spring arrived with all its extravagance, and the winter wheat harvest came in during May, golden and full. And when Virginia stood at the edge of the north field on the day the last of it was cut, and looked across at the south field, where the new corn had just been planted in expanded rows reaching toward the northeast, she felt the particular satisfaction of someone who has seen their theory fully confirmed by reality. The land that had been called worthless was producing. The water that had been declared inaccessible was running. The woman who had been offered nothing but a debt notice and a deadline had built something. She sent the May mortgage payment to the bank 2 weeks early. She did not do it to make a point, though she was aware it would make one. In June, Virginia discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Timothy on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen, with the coffee made and the sun coming through the window in that warm, direct way it did in early June, and she told him plainly, the way she told him everything, because she had learned that he received plain speech best and that he appreciated it. He looked at her across the table for a moment with an expression that she had never quite seen on his face before, all the quiet reserve entirely absent, nothing in its place but a raw and genuine joy that made him look younger and entirely open. He stood up from the table and came around to her and took her face in his hands the way he had done in the cornfield that first morning, carefully and deliberately, and looked at her with that expression for a long moment, and then said, "Virginia." "Yes," she said, smiling at him. "We are going to need a larger kitchen table," he said. She laughed out loud, the full, surprised kind that she had not done since she was young, and he was laughing too, quietly, his forehead against hers, and the morning was warm around them, and the corn was planted in the south field, and the wheat stubble was being worked back into the north field, and everything was exactly what it should be. The pregnancy was straightforward and uncomplicated in the way that Virginia seemed to approach most physical challenges, with competence, and without making an excessive occasion of it. She continued her farm work through the summer, adapting what needed adapting, enlisting Pete when she needed a second pair of hands for the heavier tasks, and only once did Timothy suggest she perhaps should not be carrying a full sack of feed across the south field in the August heat, at which point she gave him a look that ended the conversation definitively. He did not bring it up again. He did, however, quietly begin taking the heavier morning chores from her without comment, and she let him, because his way of helping was always to do the thing rather than to talk about doing the thing, and she had come to appreciate this profoundly. Their son was born in February of 1880, delivered by Mary Coburn from up the ridge, who turned out to have delivered approximately 40 babies in her decades in the Panhandle, and who handled the occasion with the same calm competence that characterized everything about her. Timothy was in the house, which Virginia had insisted upon, despite the conventions of the time which suggested he ought to wait elsewhere. "You stay," she had told him. "I want you here." And he had stayed, and he had been exactly what she needed him to be, which was present and steady and unhysterical, holding her hand through the worst of it with an expression of concentrated support that she had held onto like a rope. The baby arrived at dawn, loud and indignant about it in the way of healthy newborns, and Virginia held him and looked at his red, outraged face and felt a love so vast and sudden that it was almost frightening in its size. "He looks angry," Timothy said, looking over her shoulder at the baby. "He has opinions," Virginia said. "He is mine." Timothy kissed her hair. "He is absolutely yours," he agreed. They named him James Robert Ford, James for Virginia's father and Robert for the man who had first loved this land, and he grew into his names and his inheritance with an energy that was evident from his first weeks on earth. Pete, who visited 2 days after the birth with a wooden horse he had carved himself, and which he presented with an earnestness that was extremely moving, declared that James was the finest-looking baby he had ever seen, which was an opinion he also held about every other baby he had ever encountered, but which he delivered each time with total sincerity. The spring of 1880 brought the second full corn planting across the expanded south field, now running almost twice its original acreage, and with 2 full-time seasonal hands hired from town and the ranch crew available for harvest. The operation ran with a smooth efficiency that Virginia had designed carefully over the previous winter. Timothy had contributed the use of his additional equipment and 2 of his hands at no charge, which Virginia had accepted on the condition that she would supply the ranch kitchen with corn and wheat through the winter in exchange, which he had agreed to because it was fair, and because it made her comfortable and he understood both. Baby James supervised much of the spring planting from a blanket on the porch of the farmhouse, which Virginia had begun to think of as separate from the ranch house, though they were only 100 yards apart, and she moved between them with the easy familiarity of a woman who has arranged her life on her own terms. She kept her farmhouse as her working space, her seed catalogs and notes and planning maps spread across the kitchen table, her tools organized in the small barn with Chester, who was elderly now and largely retired from plow work but still excellent company. The ranch house was home and family, the long table and Timothy's books, and the parlor where Mary Coburn visited on Sunday afternoons. The summer was full and good. James learned to crawl in July and immediately made for the garden with an enthusiasm that suggested he had inherited his mother's relationship to growing things. Timothy watched him navigate the kitchen garden with an expression of such absolute contentment that Virginia made a point of remembering it. The image of this serious, quiet man crouched on the garden path watching his son investigate a tomato plant with all the focus and determination of a professional investigator. In August, Virginia received a letter from her younger sister, Clara, in Kansas, whose husband had died the previous spring and who was raising 2 children alone on a farm that was struggling. Virginia read the letter twice and then showed it to Timothy. "She needs help," Virginia said. Timothy read the letter. "Yes," he said. "I would like to invite her here," Virginia said. "To the Panhandle. There is the old Corley place 2 miles east that has been sitting empty. The land there is similar to mine. She could farm it. I could help her learn what I know about the soil here." Timothy looked at her. "That would be a considerable undertaking," he said. "Yes," Virginia said. He looked at the letter and then at her and then back at the letter. "I know a man who might be willing to sell the Corley deed at a fair price," he said. "Martin Oaks over in Sweetwater has been looking to liquidate his Harlow holdings." Virginia felt that familiar warmth, the recognition of a man who, when presented with a plan, immediately looks for the practical path toward it rather than the reasons against it. "Would you be willing to make inquiries?" she asked. "I will ride to Sweetwater on Thursday," he said. Clara arrived in September with her 2 children, a girl of 9 named Ida and a boy of 6 named Francis, and a wagon load of belongings and a look in her eyes that Virginia recognized intimately. The look of a woman who has been holding everything together alone for too long and has arrived somewhere she hopes might be safe. Virginia met her at the road and hugged her without ceremony, and then pulled back and looked at her and said, "You are going to be all right," with enough conviction in her voice that Clara, who had been maintaining her composure through 3 days of travel, did not manage to maintain it any longer and cried briefly, and then collected herself and looked at the Panhandle around her with an expression of determination that Virginia recognized as a family trait. Timothy had secured the Corley property deed at a fair price from Martin Oaks, and the house had been repaired and made habitable by his crew in August, and there was a working well already on the property, because the Corley family had managed to find water at least. The south field of the Corley place was different from Virginia's, heavier soil with better natural water retention, and Virginia spent the evenings of Clara's first week going through everything she knew about it, all her notes and her father's knowledge and what she had learned in the past 2 years, teaching her sister the way their father had taught her. "You are the most knowledgeable farmer I have ever met," Clara said one evening, looking up from the soil amendment notes. "I learned from father and from failure and from a man who stood at my fence every morning and asked the right questions," Virginia said. Clara looked at her. "Timothy." "Timothy," Virginia confirmed. "He is a good man," Clara said. "He is the best man I know," Virginia said without qualification. The Panhandle autumn of 1880 was dry but not damaging, and Virginia's harvest was the best she had seen yet. The expanded south field yielding enough corn to meet the mortgage obligations comfortably, supply the ranch through winter, send a share to Clara, and still have enough surplus to sell at the Harlow grain market, where the price per bushel had moved favorably with the season. She took her surplus to the market on a Saturday morning with Timothy driving the wagon and James asleep in a basket in the wagon bed, and sold it to the Harlow grain buyer, a taciturn man named Sutter who weighed and priced with scrupulous fairness, and put the money in the bank in her own account under her own name, Virginia Merritt Ford, which Harlan Voss processed without comment, but with an expression she felt was slightly more respectful than it had been 14 months ago. She paid the October mortgage installment with the market money and walked out of the First Consolidated Bank of Harlow with enough remaining to buy winter supplies and seed for the spring planting. And she stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment in the October sun and thought about November of 1878, the 40 cents and the seed corn and the 40-acre parcel that no one believed in but her. She believed in it still. She would always believe in it. That was what her father had taught her, and what the land had confirmed, and what Timothy had seen in her from the beginning, before she had the evidence to prove it to anyone else. The pure, stubborn, knowledge-backed certainty that a thing could be done if you understood it well enough, and wanted it hard enough, and were willing to learn everything the land needed to give itself to you. That winter was cold and clear. The kind of Panhandle winter where the sky was hard blue every day, and the nights were brilliant with stars. And Virginia worked the farmhouse kitchen in the mornings, and the ranch house kitchen in the evenings, and moved between her two worlds with the ease of a woman who has built her life exactly as she intended, and is comfortable in it. James was walking by December, unsteady and joyful about it, crashing into furniture and pushing himself back up with the unstoppable confidence of someone who has not yet learned to expect failure. Timothy watched him with a steady, quiet delight that Virginia had come to think of as one of his particular modes of happiness, the kind that was not loud but was absolutely present. "He is going to be stubborn," Timothy said one evening, watching James determinedly attempt to climb onto a chair that was clearly too tall for him. "He is ours," Virginia said. "Of course he is going to be stubborn." Timothy laughed, the quiet, contained kind, and reached for her hand, and she gave it, and they watched their son attempt the chair with the matching expression of two people who are completely, grounded-lie happy in a way that requires no commentary. Clara's first spring planting went in March, with Virginia walking her fields with her every other morning the way Timothy had once walked her fence line, asking questions, checking moisture levels, discussing the particular character of the Corley soil versus her own south field. Clara proved to be a quick learner and a harder worker than Virginia had even expected, and by April she had a good stand of spring wheat coming up across her east fields and the beginnings of a kitchen garden that Ida was managing with a 9-year-old's territorial pride. "Your sister is going to be all right," Timothy said, returning one evening from helping her crew fix the irrigation line on the Corley East field. "I told her she would be," Virginia said. "She believed you," he said. "Good," Virginia said. "I was right." Spring turned towards summer and the corn went into the south field for the third season, and Virginia walked the rows on the morning of planting with the hand dibber her father had made for her, the one she had used for 3 harvests now, its handle polished smooth by her grip, and she thought about her father in Kansas and the things he had taught her, and about Robert who had loved this land first, and about the morning she had walked into the bank with 40 cents and an idea, and about a quiet man at a fence line who had asked what the field needed. She planted the seed corn with the same care and the same certainty she had always had, walking the rows in the early April light, and when she straightened at the end of the last row and looked back across the full length of the south field, she heard boots behind her and did not need to turn to know who it was. Timothy came to stand beside her and looked at the planted field, and then at the sky to the west, where the spring clouds were building in the way that suggested the right kind of rain was coming, and then he looked at her. She was 33 years old, with soil on her hands and the beginning of laugh lines at the corners of her eyes that had not been there 2 years ago, and the hand dibber her father had made hanging at her side and her dark hair loose because she had not yet pinned it for the day. She was standing in the middle of everything she had built. "Another good year," Timothy said. "Yes," she agreed. "The aquifer level is up from the winter precipitation," he said. "Ben checked it last week." "I know," she said. "I read his report." He looked at her with that full, warm, unreserved expression that she had become one of the central facts of her daily life. "What do you want?" he asked. Not about the farm, just generally. It was the kind of question he asked sometimes, the larger kind. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, honestly and without rushing. "More of this," she said. "More seasons, more harvests. Another child when it is time. Clara settled and Ida grown and James old enough to walk these rows himself and understand what they mean." She paused. "You, more of you." He put his arm around her, and she put hers around him, and they stood in the planted south field with the spring clouds building above them and the irrigation channels running clean and steady from the well at 39 feet, and the whole panhandle quiet around them in that particular way it had just before the weather changed. "I think you should know," he said, "that I am going to keep standing at your fence line." "I know," she said, smiling. "I am going to keep expecting you." The rain came that afternoon. 3 days of the right kind, soaking and steady, settling into the soil without running off, reaching down past the hardpan that had been broken and never went hard again, finding the amended earth and the deep water beneath it, and the seeds set at exactly the right depth in exactly the right conditions by a woman who had known all along what the land needed. On the 11th day, the corn came up. It always came up on the 11th day now, and every time it did, Virginia went out at first light and walked the rows and looked at the small green shoots breaking through the pale earth, and felt the same thing she had felt the first time, not surprise. She had never doubted, but a kind of deep and sustaining confirmation that the world rewarded knowledge and patience, and the willingness to believe in a thing even when no one else did. This time James came with her, walking unsteadily beside her on his 16-month legs, stopping to look at each green shoot with the full focused attention of a child who finds the world astonishing, which it is. Virginia crouched beside him at one of the sprouts and let him look at it closely, his small face serious with interest. "Corn," she said. He said carefully. "Yes," she said, "that is right." She looked up, and Timothy was there at the edge of the field. Not at the fence line now, because the fence line had ceased to be the relevant boundary between them. Just at the edge of her field, watching them both with that expression she had no better word for than love, the specific, clear-eyed, full-hearted kind that did not require anything to be other than what it was. The Texas Panhandle stretched around them in every direction, flat and open and immense, the sky above it the hard clear blue of a spring morning, and the corn was coming up in the south field that the bank had called worthless, and the woman had known better, and the silent rancher next door had believed in before anyone else had the evidence to. It was 1880, and they had built something that would still be standing when they were not. Virginia Merritt Ford stood up from beside her son in the cornfield and looked at her husband and her land and her life, and what she felt was the complete and settled certainty of a woman who fought for everything she had and won, and knew exactly what the winning had cost and exactly what it had given her, and would choose every single moment of it again. She held out her hand. James took it with his small, firm grip. Timothy came across the field to her and took the other one. The corn grew up around them, and the season was going to be good.